Welcome back, welcome back. Zbigniew Brzezinski is one of the most respected figures in American foreign policy. He served as National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, and he's now supporting the Obama campaign. As America prepares for a new president, he's here to tell us about US foreign policy, what changed and what's going to have to change in the future. Mr. Brzezinski, it's a great joy to have you with us. In your new book, America and the World, with Brent Scowcroft, you say that American foreign policy under the new president is going to have to sort out dealing with the world as it is now in a time of global awakening. What's the main change in the foreign policy of America that you would like to see under a new president?
Both Brent Scowcroft and I advocate, first of all, a bipartisan foreign policy. I think it's important to return to bipartisanship. In the last 8 years, we have become polarized, and we have adopted some policies which reflect extreme attitudes, but not the fundamental outlook of the American people. Secondly, I think we have to recognize the fact that though America is obviously preeminent in the world, and even the financial crisis bears that out in a negative sort of a way, it is essential for America to consult others, to shape policies in a dialogue with others, and to abstain from unilateral actions, because the world today is too complex and American power is not omnipotence, and hence we have to be willing to lead by consensus, by accommodation, through a dialogue.
And in the election as it comes up, where you are a supporter of Senator Obama, here to do with David Cameron, the Conservative leader of the opposition, and Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown said, talking about the economy, this is no time for a novice, he said to Cameron. In the field of foreign policy, some people have suggested that it's no time for a novice in the field of foreign policy in America. But you're supporting Obama, so you don't accept that.
I don't accept that. What I accept is that one has to have some evidence of good judgment. And it was quite striking to me that Senator Obama diagnosed the implications of the American decision to go to war in Iraq correctly, whereas much of the political elite did not. Let me also remind you that in 1945, the new president of the United States was, quote unquote, a novice. I have in mind Harry Truman, a haberdasher actually. And yet, look how well he performed. So I think judgment, the sense of the person's ability to relate to the dilemmas and the challenges of the new age, that is what is important. I sense that Obama understands what is essentially new about the 21st century. I am convinced, unfortunately, that McCain is rooted entirely in the preceding century.
And what's the difference that causes between the two of them?
The difference is whether we continue the Bush policies, essentially of unilateral leadership, or whether we adopt a policy of bipartisanship at home and a realization and understanding of the meaning of interdependence globally.
And would you hope that the war on terror would feature less strongly?
First of all, I have been writing on this subject now for several years, because the war on terror was declared 7 years ago. And within weeks of that declaration, I pointed out that the term war on terror is meaningless. Terror is a technique for killing people. It's not an enemy. It's like if we defined World War II as a war on blitzkrieg. We have to be specific. Who are we against? And there are terrorist groups, organizations, extremists, and they need to be both isolated and extirpated. But a vague, generalized phrase such as war on terror is, first of all, not helpful in identifying whom to fight, and secondly, it is conducive to breeding fear. And there's nothing worse in a democracy than fear, because fear makes the public susceptible to demagogy.
Yes, as Chris Patton said last week, you can't fight a noun, which is really what you're saying about the war on terror there and so on. Do you think that on issues like Israel, Palestine, Obama will be a more positive leader than George W. Bush has been?
I think George Bush has let this issue drift and get worse and worse. And we are now at a stage at which even the possibility of a two-state solution is increasingly in jeopardy. There's little time left before it becomes impossible to achieve. And if a two-state solution of the kind that Prime Minister Olmert of Israel recently described, and used words almost identical with the ones I've been using, then what is the alternative? The alternative is, sad to say, either apartheid or war, or a combination of the two, eventually decline of American presence in the Middle East, isolation of Israel, and a great threat to its long-term survival.
And what about on the issue of Russia and Georgia? Do you think our reaction there could have been better, should have been stronger? Is there a threat of a return of the Cold War?
No, I don't think there's a threat of a return to the Cold War, because first of all, nobody wants it. Secondly, Russia cannot pursue it. The Cold War was a global contest between two superpowers, one of which, incidentally, was promoting an allegedly worldwide relevant ideology, which it turned out not to be so relevant. Russia today is essentially a Eurasian power, and even more so, partially a European power. It is, however, challenging the status quo that has emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union. It would like to reintegrate the former Soviet republics under Moscow in some disguised fashion. And this is why the independence of Georgia and of Ukraine is important to the West. But it is not an issue for the resumption of a Cold War. It's an issue that can be addressed partially by economic assistance, some military security, negotiations, while at the same time trying to foster closer links with Russia and trying to draw it more into the West. I think one of the lessons, incidentally, and that's an important point, of the recent financial crisis is that there are now elements in Russia itself that are painfully aware. They've learned in the last few weeks how painfully aware they are of Russia's own interdependence with the world. And that has certain implications for how it conducts itself.
You went quite far when you compared Putin's tactics to those of Hitler and Stalin. Do you stand by that?
Yes, the tactics were similar, but the strategy is different and the geopolitical context is different. But I think it's unfortunate if such tactics are employed. I don't think it's good for the international system. It's not good for European-Russian relations. And as the events of the last few weeks have shown, it's extremely costly for Russia itself. Look at the capital flight from Russia since August, close to $60 billion already. Look at the collapse of the Russian stock market. It's now been closed for days. In a way, this is a reminder to Putin that he cannot operate as if Russia was the Soviet Union.
Another country, of course, that you had many dealings with, and it's now back in the headlines in a different way, is Iran. Now, Senator Obama favors talks with the regime which caused such problems and humiliations to the Carter administration. Do you favor those talks, the idea of those talks, that what's the point of not talking to your enemies? You don't need to talk to your friends.
Absolutely. It seems to me that this is an important issue that needs to be discussed. Iran is an important country in a very volatile region in which we have major interests. And the nuclear issue is enormously complex. And it cannot be resolved unless we talk seriously. But we talk without preconditions. We cannot have negotiations in which we say to the other party, we'll negotiate with you, but only if, prior to the negotiations, you satisfy our central demand. That is a prescription for paralysis, to which then the only alternative becomes a war. And do we need an additional war in that part of the world? We already have one in Iraq. We have one in Afghanistan. One is beginning to develop in regions of Pakistan. Do we want to add Iran to that list?
And in terms of Afghanistan, which you mentioned there, Mr. Brzezinski, of course, when we armed the rebels there, they tended to prove in the end that the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend. Are you confident that there will be a positive outcome in Afghanistan, or is it unlikely?
Well, first of all, let's not oversimplify history. The Afghans were very appreciative of our help. And this is why we were able to overthrow the Taliban after 9/11, 2001, with only 300 soldiers. What I have been saying publicly now for several months is that we have to avoid over-militarizing our presence in Afghanistan. We are running the risk of replicating the mistake the Soviets made, who thought they could conquer Afghanistan with the help of some Afghan Marxists, but largely through an army of occupation. If we pursue that path, we'll end up having most Afghans against us, because the Afghans are independent-minded, they're xenophobic, they don't care for the presence of Western troops, different nationality, different religion than their own, using arms on their soil. We have to be seeking some form of decentralized political accommodation, and that requires much more sophistication and much less militarization in our policy.
In fact, Islamic fundamentalism has probably surprised you by its power, hasn't it? Because back in 1998, when you were interviewed and someone said that Islamic fundamentalism representing a world menace, and you replied simply with one word, nonsense. Well, it has become a worldwide menace, hasn't it?
I think we are putting all Muslims into the same camp, which is a very counterproductive definition of the problem. It's like if you were talking about terrorism in Northern Ireland, you would always refer to it as Catholic terrorism and describe it as Catholic terrorism. Let's be very careful about Islam. Most Muslims are not extremists. Most Muslim governments are relatively moderate. There is an extremist fundamentalist challenge, but even not all of it is necessarily militantly directed against us. Let me give you a very specific and pertinent example. In Afghanistan, we're dealing with Al-Qaeda and with Taliban. The real problem politically in Afghanistan is the Taliban. Is the Taliban engaged in any acts of terrorism in Great Britain, or in Spain, or in France, or in the United States? The fact of the matter is, it is not. Al-Qaeda operated out of Afghanistan, and rather stupidly and counterproductively, the Taliban regime felt committed to some sort of code of honor in not handing them over to us. But there are two different problems we have there. One is Taliban, which is a genuine Afghan phenomenon, actually a Pashtun phenomenon, and Al-Qaeda, which is a worldwide oriented terrorist organization. They overlap, but they're not the same. We ought to be smart in taking advantage of that difference.
Thank you so much. It's been really a great pleasure to talk to you today, Mr. Brzezinski, and covering all of those issues. And we really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed it too. Thanks a lot.
Our thanks to Zbigniew Brzezinski. That's it for this week. My thanks to all of my guests. Do join me again in 7 days from now for another Frost Over the World. Goodbye for now.